There's a Carly Simon song that opens with the line, "You walked into the party like you were walking into a yacht." It's a portrait of a man so permanently on display that you have to wonder how lonely he must be when the room finally empties. I have met several of these men, not all at once. They arrived at different points in my founder's life through different channels, wearing different versions of the same costume. One was a former professional athlete turned tech entrepreneur. One was a LinkedIn influencer adjacent podcast person. One was a former Wall Street man who at some point decided he wanted to do something good. What they had in common was they performed recognition beautifully, and they disappeared the moment recognition would have cost them anything. The first one I called the G.I. Joe because that's what he was. Shaped for mass consumption, a product of a culture that rewards the performance of competence over the substance of it. Former professional athlete turned tech entrepreneur. San Francisco's over 100,000 LinkedIn followers, the kind of handsome that makes people step aside. The kind of man who has probably always gotten what he wanted, with everyone quietly orbiting around him without quite knowing why. I booked a call with him on an expert marketplace. I'm not going to say which one. There are many, because I was struggling with my first prototype and wanted advice, and he looked like someone who had answers. He arrived confident, skipping pleasantries, immediately calling me Joanna. I'm always slightly irritated when people use the English version of my name. The original is pronounced with Y and a double N, and it's Joanna. And Joanna always sounds like a translation. The same meaning, just a different skin. I corrected him. I did it playfully as a joke. I said, "I'm Joanna, but you can call me Joanna." He laughed and said, "I knew you'd be Anna." That caught me off guard. Usually people get flustered when corrected about someone's name. I hadn't expected laughter. I hadn't expected delight. We moved into small talk. Church bells were ringing outside of my window. I mentioned them filling space, and he said, "I love church bells," with a kind of the childlike enthusiasm that made me pull back slightly. It felt too much, too personal, too fast. I wasn't sure what to do with someone who expressed joy that openly in a professional meeting. I moved us to the actual purpose of the call. He talked, he quoted Ford. He said that success requires doing the right things for a long time. I sat there thinking, okay, so he's an asshole after all. Then he said I needed to find the biggest group struggling with the problem I was trying to solve. I said, I think men are the biggest group struggling with it. I offered a sociological observation. I thought it was smart. He looked at me and said, "Yes, I'm lonely. I'm a pretty lonely guy." I stared at him. My body almost collapsed into itself. That particular feeling when something unexpected lands and your whole system has to recalibrate in real time. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I didn't know if he was responding to what I'd said, or if it was a signal of availability, or whether he simply meant it exactly as it sounded. I didn't know, so I did nothing with it. I left it hang there and changed the subject. He told me to run interviews and report back in 2 weeks. He said, I don't have to pay for another call. I just have to DM him. We wrapped up his last words. "I hope you have a really good day," with warmth, with emphasis, with the same glee that happened with the sentence, "Oh, I love church bells." I DM'd him to arrange the second call. He replied, and then he stopped replying. So I booked another call. I came prepared. Notes, a real report on what I found in my interviews. The longing for community, the need to belong, the sense of purpose people were missing. I wasn't performing this time. I was just talking about something I actually cared about. I mentioned a woman I'd spoken with who said that in the past people had real community. And I'd agreed that when my parents were young, then under communism, when there was nothing, people gathered constantly. And yes, there was a great deal of vodka involved. He smiled at that. I made eye contact, which I don't usually do easily. But I wanted to make my point, and I could see him watching me, sighing occasionally. I told him that if someone feels lonely, even when surrounded by people, perhaps those simply aren't the right people. His face turned red. I can feel that you care, he said. Yes, I'm very passionate about it, I replied, keeping the line exactly where it was because his sentence had felt slightly too personal, and I wasn't going to step over it just because he wanted me to. He gave me the next step: post about the app, find 5 people who love it, and actually use it. First signals of product market fit. We're almost done, and then he said, "Do you know Slack?" "Yes," I replied. "Slack started as a gaming company." "Yes, I know that. I'm looking at Slack right now." "So that's what you brought it up." He was stalling. I said I needed to go. He smiled. "It was good to see you. I really hope you'll have a good day." He lifted his hat to wave about 5 seconds before I did, as though he'd calculated the exact moment I would, and he wanted to get there first. And then he ghosted again. I was angry. There were moments I genuinely hated him, not because he was evil, he wasn't, but because the shape of it was so familiar. Someone arrives with warmth, with promises, makes you believe something is available, and then disappears the moment you stop performing and start being real. I filed that one away and moved on. The second man found me through LinkedIn during a period when I was still working out who I was online. He was more established than I was, knew the LinkedIn influencer whose course I'd bought, and had a podcast of his own. He knew I was considering starting my own show, and he encouraged me, told me my personal brand had real depth. So I recorded my first episode and sent him the link, hoping for feedback. He did nothing. No reply, nothing. I spent hours turning it over. What had I done? What was wrong with the episode? What was wrong with me? The way you do at the beginning before you learned to read the pattern. And then a year passed. I was sitting on a hospital bed, waiting for test results to arrive, when a message instead of a test result arrived on my LinkedIn. And it was, "How's the podcast going?" I genuinely had to think about who he was. There was no emotional charge left at all at that point, and not even irritation. I'd moved on, found my voice, figured out who I actually am online entirely without him. I replied, eventually, briefly. He wrote back fast, asked about my new angle. I told him I was now focused on sharing my experience as autistic founder. He said that that was such an unfair advantage and that it would help me enormously. Something in me closed quietly but completely. I asked myself a simple question: what is the point of replying to this man? There wasn't one. So I ghosted him, not out of pettiness, or not only that, but because I had no more bandwidth for the performance of someone offering help that never materializes. He'd had a year-long opportunity to be useful, and he'd used none of it. Beach, please. The third man I met through an online networking platform. We were matched, which already creates a false intimacy. The algorithm had decided you belong together, so you both arrive with a slight obligation to make it work. He was older, former Wall Street guy. He described himself as someone who had done well and now wanted to do something good, which is a particular kind of retirement project that I've learned to hold loosely. He was warm, effusive even. He said he would introduce me to the right people, that he would vet them for me, that he had contacts that he knew how to open doors. And then he said something I've thought about many times since. You have so much light. I hope you never lose that. I thanked him. I believed him. A little the way you believe people when you're early enough in building something that any door sounds better than the ones currently closed. I asked if he would look at my pitch deck and give me feedback. And he agreed to that on that call. And I sent him a message with a link. And obviously, I never heard back. 3 men, 3 versions of the same script. The warmth arrived first. Always. I laugh when you correct your name. Your personal brand has a real depth. You have so much light. The warmth is real, I think. Or really enough in the moment. It's not cynical. It's more than they love the feeling of being the person who sees you. The recognition costs nothing. The follow-through is where the bill arrives. Then comes the promise. A second call, no charge, feedback on your episode, introductions, vetted, the right people. Promises are also cheap. They feel generous. They create connection. They make the promiser feel like the protagonist of your own helpful story. And then reality, an actual file, an actual message, an actual moment when helping would require a Tuesday afternoon instead of a pleasant feeling. And they go quiet. And the quiet tells you everything the woman had not. Sometime later I saw the G.I. Joe post praising a young man, late 20s, probably, for discovering something before the world caught up. A few days after, the same young man appeared on Forbes 30 Under 30. I felt a pang of jealousy. I felt almost like he was parading with some blonde that has legs up to here, and I felt ugly in a professional way, of course, because I was already in my 30s. I wasn't on any list. I was still figuring things out while this man was dispensing approval to someone half my age and watching them land on the list I was too old for. Of course, rationally mythological nonsense. The average age of a successful entrepreneur is the late 30s. The Forbes list is more about visibility than any achievement. His approval means very little about anyone's actual trajectory. And still, the sting, the jealousy was... I've been thinking about Andy Warhol lately because he helps me understand something about what's happening in these interactions. Robert Greene classifies Warhol as a cold coquette, someone so apparently self-sufficient, so indifferent to the room's opinion that people went wild trying to earn his attention. At parties, Warhol arrived and stood in corners. He answered questions in the fewest possible words. The world called it a performance, mystique, genius. I think he finally just became himself. He was almost certainly autistic, and what looked like enigmatic self-possession to the outside world was, I suspect, something simpler and more familiar. A neurodivergent person who had finally stopped apologizing for how they naturally move through the world. Before that, Warhol had chased relentlessly, fixated on Truman Capote, showing up in his house, sending letters after letters to him. Capote reportedly called him a desperate loser who would never amount to anything. He was trying too hard. Then something shifted. He stopped chasing. He retreated behind dark glasses and silver wig. And the less he seemed to need the room, the harder the room worked to reach him. Greene noticed this effect without quite naming the cause. When someone creates genuine space around themselves, not performed aloofness, but actually self-containment. Other people rush to fill it. They become uncomfortable with the silence and reveal themselves, trying to end it. The mask slip. You learn an enormous amount about a person by staying still and letting them talk. Watch any Warhol interviews and see this dynamic exactly. He maintains minimal eye contact. His answers are short, sometimes monosyllabic. The interviewer works visibly harder to get anything out of him, while he sits there and says things like, "Oh, I just really like a soup." The world decided this was profound. It built an entire critical framework around it. The Campbell's soup paintings became a commentary on mass culture, on consumer society, on the flattening of meaning in post-war America. The simpler truth is probably that he liked soup. He painted what he knew. People saw what they needed to see, and he let them, because correcting their projection would have cost more than it was worth. Being a mirror is lonely. You rarely get to express yourself because people are too busy projecting, filling the space with their own noise, their own needs, their own desire for connection with someone who seems not to need it. Warhol knew that loneliness. He built the factory as a refuge for misfits, creating belonging for everyone around him, and then went home alone and wrote in his diary, "I just have to be in love now or I go crazy. I just have to feel something." He built belonging for everyone else and never quite found it for himself. Here's what I've come to understand about the G.I. Joe, the podcast guy, and the Wall Street man. They weren't seeing me, they were seeing their reflection in me, their version of themselves that notices people, encourages them, opens doors, has so much to offer. The warmth, the light, the real depth, that was what they needed to believe about themselves, finding its occasion in my presence, which is why reality broke the circle every time. When I sent an actual file, when I showed up in the second call with notes and communism and vodka and genuine passion for the problem, when I asked for actual feedback on the actual pitch deck, I'd stop being a mirror. I'd become a person, and a person has needs that don't conveniently reflect your back at you. Reflects yours back at you. I saw myself in all of them too. In a way, I don't entirely like to admit I know the performer. I've practiced the surface of myself for years because being fully myself in most rooms was not an option I had been given. I know what it costs. I know that exhaustion of calibrating your presentation in real time, of saying think instead of feel in a professional context because you know exactly what label the letter earns. The difference is that I'm doing something about it. I got the diagnosis. I discovered that I'm autistic. I build the things I believe in. I make the podcast where I say the parts I'm not supposed to say out loud. They ghosted. Call it being busy. The other difference between me and Warhol is that I have what he didn't. Not fame, not the factory, not the critical frameworks, something smaller and more useful. People who love me in full knowledge of who I am, not the performance, the actual thing. That makes me less lonely than all his proximity to greatness even made him. Warhol longed for a husband his whole life and largely didn't have one. He must have carried an enormous private weight about being, yet again, different from what the world said he should be. The parties thrown in his honor were probably overwhelming. He left them early. People said how very Warhol. He built a room for everyone who didn't fit. He just never quite fit inside it himself. I'm trying to build something in the same territory, tools for connection for people who have always been on the outside of the room. And I told his story as a quiet warning. Don't get so bizarre up in solving the problem that you forget to leave the answer. When someone real walks into the room, genuinely real, not performing, not reflecting back what you want to see, it is either the best thing that can happen to you or the most frightening. It depends entirely on how long you've been running from yourself. Some people stay, those are your people. Some people ghost, and that tells you something too. Not about your worth, but about theirs, about how far they still have to go before they can be in a room with someone who isn't hiding. You don't have to wait for them to get there. You don't owe your realness to someone who can only handle the performance. I started with Carly Simon. I end with something simple. They could handle the performance. They couldn't handle me. And that is fine because I'm done performing for people who can't. I'm Joanna, not Joanna. This has been After the Pitch, where we say the quiet part out loud and wait 5 seconds before the call ends.